Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of A Sip of Knowledge with Marty Duffy, Lou Bryson, and Liz Rhoades. Plus, this week, special guest Dr. Nick Morgan. I'm going to let your host give a more formal introduction to him in just a minute. Before I turn things over, as always, I'm Will Hookinga from Zavvy.co, and just want to point out a few ways that you can interact with everyone here today throughout the show. So, on your right, as many of you have discovered, there's a chat box. So, feel free to say hello and let us know where you're joining us from. I see people from all over the country and the world so far, so it's always fun to see that. If you have a question at any point in the show for Nick or your host, there's a little button at the bottom of the screen that says Ask a Question. So just click that button, type your question in, hit send. I'll be keeping an eye out for those throughout the show today. And last but not least, feel free to invite your friends to join us. There's a button at the top, a share button. It makes it easy to do that. But yeah, with that said, I think that's everything on my list. So Liz, Lou, Marty, I'll turn things over to you now.
Oh, thanks there, Will. Hey, it's interesting, Will. I was in a bar last night, and the weirdest thing happened. A white horse just walked straight into this whiskey bar, went right up to the bar, and asked the bartender, "Hey, what whiskey do you have?" And he goes, "Well, we have a number of different whiskeys. We have black and white. You might like that, and we have Johnny Walker, and hey." We even have one named after you." And he goes, "Really? You got a whiskey named Eric?" So there. So anyways, white horse.
And here I thought it was a horse, but it was a shaggy dog.
Yeah, Nick, you like that, huh? Yeah, that.
Yeah.
Boom, bring it all back.
Eric, obviously.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Martin Duffy. I am a former senior master of whiskey, as Dr. Nick will go into great detail about later, for 14 glorious years. Then I was for 18 glorious, not so glorious months. I was the national brand ambassador for Benedictine French liqueur. What? And then 8 years as co-producer of the Chicago Independent Spirit Expo. And for the last, I don't have a freaking.
No way.
Wait a minute. I got a glass. For the last 7 years, I've been the sole brand representative for Glencairn Crystal. Oh, look at that. Oh, precious. My precious. Eh? All right. Thanks. All right, Lizard, take it away.
Amazing. Thank you, Marty. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm Liz Rhoades, technical distiller and spirit consultant. Have over a decade experience in alcoholic beverage, spanning across several different product types and spirit types, including beer, rum, vodka. But my particular favorite and expertise, and I'm hesitant to say expertise, Dr. Nick, because I did enjoy reading your section about experts and expertise. I want to dig into that a little bit. But regardless, whiskey is kind of my main squeeze. That's sort of what I'm into. These guys are into that too, obviously. So thank you for joining. I spent most of my career at a tiny little mom and pop company known as Diageo, but am now currently founder and principal at Spirit Safe Consulting. And don't fear, if you're wanting to know a little bit more about Spirit Safe Consulting, there's actually a link to my website. You just scroll down to the About the Host section and give it a little click. Check it out. Lou?
Thanks, Liz. My name is Lou Bryson. I am a whiskey writer. I spent 20 years as the managing editor at Whiskey Advocate magazine, toiling away in the whiskey mines. And now I am back to the freelance world. I am a senior drinks writer for the award-winning Daily Beast website. And of course, as Marty is so graciously indicating, thank you, Liz, have those two books that I am flogging at any given moment. And my drink today, in honor of Nick, I'm drinking Johnny Walker Black.
Excellent.
Always a good choice.
Lou,
Try
did
to
you
mention.
mention you were actually going to be at the American Craft Spirits
I
Association?
am going to be at the American Craft Spirits Association meeting in Louisville on December 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And I will be flogging those books there to the best of my abilities. I believe it's on Sunday. There's a book market between noon and 2:30 at the hotel. So I will be happy to sign anyone's copy and sell you one if you have not.
Yeah.
So,
Or he'll just sign a book in front of you. You don't
any
have to buy it.
damn book you put in front
You
of
don't
you.
have to buy it.
Be careful. It's a reflex at this point.
All righty.
Marty, back to you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here again this week. We have a returning guest, very special, important man, a man who's been, as far as I'm concerned, he's responsible for the surge in single malts and Scotch whiskey sales. He'll deny it, and he'll even make fun of me, I'm sure. But he's a very important man. He was on earlier this year with his first book, which I think it was all about power walking, the long stride. So that was whiskey and power walking.
Mall walking.
It sounded like a good book until I read the acknowledgments, didn't see my name. Screw it. Now he has a new book, and I'm thinking he's trying to outdo Jim Murray, because it's everything you wanted to know about whiskey but was afraid to ask. So this was a little shocking. I didn't see anything about whiskey in there. Not one thing. So that I'm going through it. I'm going, Dick, what the heck are you talking about here? Until it dawned on me. Hello.
Wrong book.
Wrong book.
Yeah.
So I got all the way through that one. This one I still have to catch up. But it's everything you need to know about whiskey, but we're afraid to ask. Well, I'm afraid I'm gonna ask, because we're gonna dive deep into your book, Mr. or should I call you Dr. Morgan?
Oh, you should call me Doctor, actually, Marty. Yeah.
All right, Nick. Well, I mean, anybody who saw you on our last show, which was a highly viewed show, I'm guessing. I'm just saying that.
Just make the numbers up.
I am. I'm just making. I believe it was in the tens of millions watched that show. But could you recount a little bit of your history? Because, and not all of it, because it goes back decades, almost 100 years. So how'd you get into the whiskey business? And then how'd you get into writing books?
Sure thing, Marty. Well, first of all, thanks to you and Liz and Lou for having me back. So that's very, very kind of you to let me speak for a little while. I'm a historian by training, and which is where the doctor comes from. And I ended up by sort of quite a circuitous way teaching Scottish history at the University of Glasgow. And while I was there, I was invited to go to London to speak to some people at a company called United Distillers, which had been set up as the spirits division of the Guinness company after the Guinness business had acquired the Distillers company in 1987. For those that don't know, the Distillers company was about 70% of Scotch whisky at that point, maybe 60, 70%. And these guys wanted to appoint an archivist for this new company. So I was interviewed for that job and was very lucky enough to be appointed into that role. That was in 1990, and set up what became the largest historical archive of spirit beverage in the world, which is now managed by a whole team of professional archivists in a place called Menstrie in Scotland. So that's a huge, brilliant thing that I'm very proud to have had some small part in. But after about 3 or 4 years, I sort of outgrew that role and sidestepped into marketing. And then in 1997, when the Guinness company merged with Grand Metropolitan to form Diageo. I somehow miraculously became global marketing director for single malt whiskey, which is like one of those smoke and mirror tricks. I don't really quite know how that happened, but it did. And then I spent 12 or 15 years, probably too long slightly, in that role, Marty, and then moved into some communication roles. And then about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I suppose now, actually, started researching and writing the Johnnie Walker history, which was published last year in the bicentenary of the company. It's born 1820, still going strong, as the famous catchphrase goes. And that was sort of my exit project from Diageo. And, you know, I was very privileged to be given the opportunity to both research and write that. It was a shame that this is a company that celebrated its centenary in the middle of a global Spanish flu pandemic, and celebrated its bicentenary in the middle of a COVID pandemic. So I'm not planning to be around for the 300th anniversary.
They're planning on bringing back the plague for the third one.
So the book was published last year. I left Diageo at the end of last year, 2020, and at that point had already started working a little bit on this new book that's just been published. And so as I spent the first lockdown, COVID lockdown, finishing off and editing the Johnnie Walker book, so I spent the third lockdown, the first half of this year, writing the new book. And that went to the press at the end of May, and was published here in September. And I think now I hope is on the shelves in the United States. I was certainly told it would be by the publishers.
I thought it has a release in December. No,
was it December now? Okay, so it's slipped a little bit then. Yeah,
because I think that's what it reads on Amazon.
Right,
that's going to be available in
just
early December.
Just in time for the holiday season. I mean,
that's right.
What else?
No coincidence, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolute coincidence.
Well, Nick, you were now. I mean, and again, this is why I think you're a very valuable man to this industry, in that your reach was very far. You hired Mike Veach as the archivist at Stutz-Weller, and he's gone on to be quite the apostle of bourbon.
Absolutely.
Now, did you hire Christine McCafferty at?
No, because I'd already stepped aside from the archive when Christine was appointed. I was already in a sort of rather odd hybrid marketing role just at the end of United Distillers.
But she's been heading up this new Johnnie Walker Prince Street.
Well, she's played a very large role, I think, in the development of the Johnnie Walker experience in Princes Street in Edinburgh. And I think the archive and its materials are very well represented in this massive building, huge investment in Scotch whisky tourism in the centre of the capital of Scotland. It's quite an astonishing thing.
I know that archive. I visited the archive back in my Diageo days, and it was amazing. Didn't they have Johnnie Walker's suit? I remember seeing a jacket or something. It looked like Johnnie Walker had been vaporized out of his little Striding Man suit. It wasn't the actual Striding Man suit, because that was just kind of made up, but there was like some of his clothes. And anyways, let's talk about your book.
Actually, before we do that,
yes, sir.
Just because I think anyone that heard it, their minds will still be reverberating at your joke. But one of the things they do have in the archive, of course, is a life-size white horse.
Whoa.
Which was one of a number that were made for promotional activities that they did in the UK back in the 80s. And I think there were about 20 of these things made. And can you believe that 19 of them were stolen? Now,
yes, I did believe that.
How do you walk out of an event with a life-size white horse underneath your jacket? You know, I really don't know.
Well, they used to do the cow thing here in Chicago. There was a special thing where different groups would paint cows, and I guess
Oh, yeah.
it was supposed to be a tribute to Mrs. O'Leary's cow that started the Chicago Fire, and so they're decorated. And eventually, tried to sell a lot of them off, but a lot of them were stolen.
Mm.
You know, it's just, come on, it's a cool cow, artistically painted. Who wouldn't want one? So with that said, your new book, ambitious is all I can say. That's what it really should read, ambitious, because you're saying everything you want to know about whiskey.
No. Need to know.
Need.
Yeah, need.
to know. Very
Need.
important difference.
That's my choice.
That
Need
screws
it.
up all
It's
of
my
my
choice. No.
that screws up all of my questions. I'm thinking all about want, and now it's need. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it's everything you need. But look, I guess you people really don't need
Concise.
to know that much. It's very concise. So what got you thinking about this in particular? Because Lou's book, Tasting Whiskey, and actually even his masterclass, he had talked about, here I want to put out a book that's it's really what you just need to know. Right, Lou? Is that what you told
Essentially.
me? Yeah, there you go. So what got you thinking about that?
Well, the book is published by Ebury, who are part of Penguin Random House, and it's published in association with the Whisky Exchange, who many people I'm sure are listening will know back in here in London. And I was asked to go and speak to Sukhinder Singh at the Whisky Exchange and one of his colleagues, Chris Mabin, and they asked me if I'd be interested in writing a book, a sort of general book about whiskey. And they had an idea in their head about what they wanted the book to be. And Sukhinder in particular had some ideas he felt very strongly about. And I sort of agreed with some of those, and maybe some I didn't, and I had some thoughts of my own. I then went to speak to the publishers. They had a slightly different set of ideas, I think, from Sukhinder, not completely different, but slightly different. So I took what I'd heard from Sukhinder away, I took what I heard from the publishers away, and I had loads of stuff in my head that was left over from writing the Johnny Walker book. I mean, literally a head full of stuff that I hadn't managed to get in there, as well as 30 years experience in the business and lots of stuff I wanted to get off my chest a little bit that I'd sort of come across during that period. So that was where I came across this idea of a book that would be quite wide-ranging. And maybe, Marty, that's where the everything comes in, because it's from how you make whiskey, which you sort of have to have a chapter on how you make whiskey in a book, right? But to the literature of whiskey, in particular, the literature of Scotch whisky, talking about whiskey as a business, which many people sometimes seem to think it isn't. They seem to think distillers are philanthropists who are just there to give their whiskey away. Well, the bad news is it's always been about business. Making whiskey is about making money, So I talk about that at some degree of length. I sort of try and pop a few balloons about popular misconceptions, both sort of about the history of whiskey and what happens in whiskey today. Raise some questions about issues like all this stuff about terroir that we keep on reading about, which I'm sure Liz has got her own point of view on.
Of course. Yeah, because everyone seems to have an opinion on terroir these days.
Well, if you haven't got an opinion on terroir, what have you got?
What are you doing with your life? Yeah.
I really like the malt mill part.
Sorry, Lou.
The malt mill part. I love that you put that in there, because I think that's an interesting story. I mean, it's not terroir of the grain; it's terroir of the production.
Place. It's the stuff about the place. And I know that Dave Broom, and I talk about that a little bit in the book. And actually, there's a great story from Monique Houston, who I think might be on this.
Yeah, she is.
She is.
Well, Monique told me about this story about sausage making in Chicago, which finds its way into the book as well. Perhaps to people's surprise, but it's perfect in talking about how a place can affect how things are made, and things that people do and unthinkingly can affect how things are made, how they taste at the end of the day. And that's certainly true of whiskey. And I very strongly subscribe to that view. And I talk about the fact that in in years gone by, distillery managers, and all this stuff about sacrosanct cobwebs in the corner of still houses and all this sort of stuff. Well, there's a bit of romantic nonsense there, but they had a strong belief that there was something in the place over and above the science that contributed to what happened. So yeah, Lou, it's the malt mill story is a great one about place and how you can do some things in the place and then other things you can, no matter how much you try, you can't.
I always thought with Scotch, especially Scotch whiskey, I mean, I've never really saw it as much with, say, if you go down to Kentucky and go visit the various distilleries, it didn't ring true as much as in Scotland. In that one time we went up to Skye, we went to Talisker, and I had Talisker for the first time on Skye. After especially standing by the shore and this wind coming through and trying to dodge sheep poop all over the place. And you go in and give me a Talisker 10. I taste it and I go, oh my God, this kind of tastes like the island. This tastes like everything minus the sheep poop. But it just had the whole idea. I know the whole idea of regionality and, the effects of the regions, little some of that's fairy tale.
I think that's one of. Sorry, Marty. Go continue. I was just gonna.
No. I was slowly phasing out.
Okay, I caught that. So, yeah. But I think that's one of the really interesting things about sensory, right? It's very psychological, where and to me, it's like, okay, we're quickly talking about terroir because we stepped into that, which is fine. It's
better than stepping into the sheep.
Yes.
And believe me,
perhaps we'll end up in the same place if this conversation goes on.
Yeah,
I was one of the lucky ones.
Totally different sensory experience, but I digress. But yeah, it's the whole notion of you step into a room full of distillers, you say, what is terroir? And you get, 20 different answers. And for me, I like to think that the human experience, the human terroir, which, has to do with it's time and place too, but exactly what Marty said, there's a psychological notion, and where I am, my mood, what time of day it is, like all that I think affects, the experience, which is, Marty, to your point, okay, well, I was here where it was, where this whiskey is being created, therefore my experiences.
Yeah, but at the same time, Liz, it wasn't like I was just being Jedi mind tricked on it. It was really a unique experience. I didn't find at every distillery. And I think Talisker is just kind of a very unique single malt. I mean, that ocean character that you pick up on it, it was so vivid, even to this day. But to your point, Lou, I've talked to you about this in the past. Lou and John Hansel had put together a round table many years ago for Whiskey Advocate or Malt Advocate at the time, and you had all these different guys. You had Willie Tate, and you had John Glazer and George Grant, all these guys. Anthony Burnett was there, and the question was, where does this ocean character come from these island whiskeys or coastal whiskeys? And there was 20 guys there, Lou, and about 20 different answers.
At least a dozen. Yeah.
I mean, there are people poo-pooing it. So Nick, I mean, did you guys at Diageo, did you guys ever come to a consensus of, how much does any of that really come into play, or was it all malarkey? Was it all, as far as say where, whiskey was aged, where was it being matured, laid down? Was it really picking up the atmosphere
or flavor?
Any of it? Or we used to talk about Dalwhinnie having a heathery character because the mountains surrounding it were, full of heather. Well, was it though? It's freaking Scotland. I mean, heather is everywhere.
Scotland's quite important though, Marty, because Diageo and other companies as well mature most of their whiskey not at distilleries, but in centralized warehousing facilities. And in the case of Diageo, one is near Stirling Castle, and the other one, the new one they built, is in Fife, both on the East Coast, both actually very close to the sea. So,
but they don't.
And Scotland's a small maritime climate,
right? You're never
so
more than 75 miles from the ocean.
Yeah, so wherever you are in Scotland, from maturation purposes, you're going to, broadly speaking, be subject to. I mean, it's a bit colder if you're up at Royal Lochnagar Distillery, up on Deeside. That gets the -20s, which you would not get across on Skye or on Islay. But broadly speaking, it's the same. So for maturation, I know some people are very fussy about doing it the same place if you've got room, but really maturation, don't think so. But where it's made, the actual where it's made, well, you just think of Islay, think of that South Shore, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Laphroaig, and pretty soon another distillery just tucked in at the end before you get into Port Ellen on the south side of the island. And the ones that are there making whiskey already make whiskey that's totally different. It's totally different. And yet, to all intents and purposes, it's the same place. It's a distillery. You got a mill, you got a mash, you got fermenters, you got these copper pot stills. Totally different whiskies. And the story that Lou mentioned about the famous malt mill distillery, which Peter Mackie built inside the grounds of Lagavulin in the early part of the 20th century after he'd lost the agency for Laphroaig, which his family had had for many, many years, many decades of selling Laphroaig, making a lot of money out of it. So when he lost that, he was a pernickety sort of fellow, he decided he'd make Laphroaig himself at Lagavulin in this new distillery. And I think he stole one of the guys that worked at Laphroaig, and there were nefarious things about the water and all this sort of stuff to try and replicate exactly making Laphroaig at Lagavulin. And of course, this malt mill distillery didn't make Laphroaig, it made malt mill, because distilleries sort of make what they want to make at the end of the day. And I know, which without spilling any confidences, if you wanted to talk to the men who commissioned Rose Isle Distillery, where they had a very specific idea of what they wanted Rose Isle to make, and Rose Isle clearly had a very specific idea of what they wanted to make. So there is this thing about place, and it's not just place. I think it's people and lots of stuff that goes on there, and that's one of the magic things. I mean, I've lucky to spend a lot of time with very, very clever whiskey making people. So generally, actually, without being rude, not distillery managers, but the guys in white coats, the real boffins that understand the science, the technology behind it. And Liz, you can see if this resonates with you. But most of them certainly don't want to know everything. They relish the fact that there is something unknowable in the process.
Yeah, I think to that point, and I kind of made a joke about reading your chapter on experts and expertise, but I think that's one of the most exciting things about this industry is that there's always something new, right? Like there's always something new to learn, and it's never ending, which is it's exciting, right? And to your point, maybe we don't need to know, or it's just that hunt, right? It's that hunt for learning more.
Well, see, that's always been my thing. Everybody wants to know everything now. I mean, I'm just talking about consumers want to break down whiskey to its molecules. And it's like, guys, just pour it in your glass, sit back and enjoy it. I mean, enjoy some of the mystery. And I always love, especially again with Scotch, it's one of the things that always puts it forefront in my mind as one of my favorites, because there is a mystery to it. Our friend Mike Miller, who owns Delilah's here in Chicago, he brought it up a long time ago. He was explaining to somebody, if you like bourbon, you'll like most bourbons to varying degrees because there's a bourbon character. But Scotch, I mean, especially single malts, they run the gamut. I mean, you got some that are, briny and smoky and peppery and spicy, and then you got others that are sweet and light and slightly fruity. It's this whole weird gamut, and you go, wait a minute, it's all barley, water, the yeast. How the hell is it so different? Obviously, little changes in production, but basically the same ingredients, and yet such a spectrum.
Let's talk about experts though, because Liz made a joke and then refer to it again. I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to do in the book was sort of debunk some of this expert stuff, because although sadly the publishers insisted on describing me as an whiskey expert,
I was gonna.
yeah. So really, I would never use that term myself. And all I found out writing the Johnny Walker book, for example, was what I didn't know. I just became aware of what I didn't know and didn't understand. And the same thing doing this second book.
Yep.
Which is great because it's given me lots of ideas things to research and write about. But my idea is I see myself not as an expert, but in the 17th century, people who were struggling to try and find different forms of religious belief at a time of political and religious turbulence in the United Kingdom were often called searchers or seekers after the truth, searchers after the truth. And in a way, that's why I'm a journeyman seeker. I'm just trying to find that stuff out. And a bit like not wanting to know everything about how whiskey is made. I don't want to know everything, because once I know everything, once I'm an expert, what's the point? I mean,
we're done.
Yeah, the fun's over.
So
yeah, there you go.
So I'm not happy when I hear people describe themselves as experts in their Instagram descriptions and Facebook and other social media. And I think the warning in the book, there are quite a few warnings in the book. One of the warnings, if anyone says they're an expert, don't believe them. Really don't believe them.
I was the same way. I used to get people would ask me to come in and do a whiskey tasting, and I do, and they want to call me a whiskey expert. And I go, man, I am not an expert. I'm an enthusiast.
Yeah,
I'm very enthusiastic about whiskey, and I there's a lot of stuff I might know more about some aspects of whiskey than you do, but that don't make me no expert. I'm not a Liz who can actually make it. I'm in fact, I've never made a whiskey before in my life.
Always.
But I think that's the fact that people do put themselves out as experts. And again, to the point that I was trying to make about the book, I mean, obviously it's what you need to know as opposed to what you want to know. But you need I'm always constantly learning something new about whiskey. And that's why when people have asked, hey, Marty, why don't you write a book? And I go, first off, who the hell wants to read what I know about whiskey? And then two, by the time I got done writing it, I'd probably find out a bunch of stuff that I didn't know.
Right.
I mean, it's funny because like I said, it was very clear that it was going to be incumbent upon me to write a chapter on how you make whiskey, and I don't know how many people have written chapters on how you make whiskey, right? It's like it's really, do I have to do this? Yes, you have to do this. And so I thought, well, okay, this is going to take about half an hour. Much to my embarrassment, I found myself sitting in front of my computer going, exactly how do you?
Yes.
And unfortunately, I had lots of sort of Liz's on the phone. Just explain that bit to me about it, because I thought I understood it, but when it comes to writing it down, I'm not entirely sure that I do. And even when I got my even when we had the final copy, Billy Abbott from the Whiskey Exchange, who's just published a really interesting book himself called The Philosophy of Whiskey. Billy was asked, unbeknownst to me, to read the How You Make Whiskey chapter, and Billy came up with 3 things that were horrendously wrong in it at that very last stage, for which I'm very grateful for him talking about, which were actually not about Scotch whiskey, about some of the other whiskies that I talk about in the styles of whiskey that I talk about in the book. But so you, even when you think you know a lot, and Lou will know this, writing stuff down is a real test of what your knowledge and your real comprehension as well. I think
I know when I was trying to get sour mash nailed down, I think I wound up talking to 6 different people before and I'm not sure it was that I wasn't understanding it. There was a certain amount of, because this was back when there were still a lot of empirical distillers around, practical distillers. I'm not sure they actually understood what was happening.
Yeah,
they just knew how it worked.
But sour mash, which I thought I understood perfectly, because I can remember being with who was the gentleman that was the last distillery manager at Stitzel Weller? Ed Foote. So my first tour of a distillery was Stitzel Weller when it was still making whiskey in 1990 or 1991. Wasn't going to make whiskey for much longer,
Yeah.
And Ed Foote showed me around, and I'm in that room. I remember him talking to me about sour mash and explaining it. Elegant gentleman, very clear, and then I came to write it down. What a mess! What a mess!
I think this, and maybe this dovetails into a lot of things. What you're saying is, oh well, this is just how we've always done it. This is tradition. This is what we call it. But I mean, just talking about sour mash alone, I think there's so many different definitions.
Yeah.
And that tends to muddle things up.
As I discovered. Yeah.
So,
but I have to say the whole setback versus backset thing just says so much about whiskey for me. That they're both exactly traditional terms for exactly the same thing. I'm just like, there you are. It's
well, I think quite early on in that first chapter, I say, why have one term for something in
yes,
when you can have as many as you want?
Well, but that brings up a point. I mean, you really come from the world of Scotch whiskey. However, you also worked for a company that owned, Canadian whiskey and bourbon and never
Irish
had Japanese whiskey, Irish whiskey. Yeah. So when it came down to writing about it, I mean, how hard was it for you to go and then you have to decipher these different terms? There could have been a Scotch whiskey, counterpart, but it was a completely different term, and the process might have been slightly different. But now you have to try to explain it. And it always struck me that guys in Scotland, the Scotch makers you talk to, only had the kind of a basic idea of how bourbon was made, and vice versa. In which I always thought, wow, if I was making whiskey, I'd want to know how whiskey was made all over the place, just because I might want to incorporate some kind of new idea. How hard was that for you?
Well, I mean, I'm lucky to have visited distilleries in Japan, in Canada. Obviously, as you know, I spent a lot of time in Kentucky, and at Seal Lampshade, George Dickel, one of my favorite distilleries in the world, and in Ireland. So I sort of had some personal experience of these places. I'd spoken to gentlemen like Ed Foote, so I if I hadn't learned, at least I'd heard from people who really knew what they were talking about. And I'm surrounded by books here, which also help. And I suppose, to be honest, if anyone's sort of wondering, well, is the book about Scotch? Is it about whiskey? I mean, it's predominantly about Scotch. And I would like to think that certainly in those few opening chapters about how it's made and stuff like that, the amount of word space given to each category reflects their global sales. So that's the way I figure it more or less works out. That's the way I try to do it. So that meant I couldn't go into the same depth about making bourbon as I did about making Scotch or about making Japanese whiskey, whatever it might be.
You do address Canadian whiskey and Irish, Japanese, Scotch, bourbon. I don't see anything about Australia, which is going to
Australia is undoubtedly mentioned in there.
It just wasn't on the little tiny list I was looking at, which is something, just because whiskey is taken off in Australia big time. I mean, not only their own production, but just their the enthusiasm for everything whiskey.
Well, it was Marty, one of the biggest export markets for Scotch in the 19th century. One of the first really big export markets for Scotch, because Scotch whiskey thrived on the markets that the British Empire provided it with before it came to the United States. And within the colonies, as they were called, it moved around following mineral wealth. So when people discovered gold and diamonds, whatever else it might be, they pretty soon discovered Scotch whiskey as well. And so you see it go through Australia, New Zealand, Canada, but certainly South Africa. When gold and diamonds were discovered in South Africa, you want to see the Johnny Walker order book. I mean, it goes absolutely nuts. Absolutely nuts.
Yeah, the youngest
oil's probably the same way.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Venezuela there.
Talking about Australia, Marty, I mean, they were making whiskey in Australia in the 19th century.
Oh, I believe it.
And then the Distillers Company set up a huge distillery at a place called Corio there to make whiskey. So it's, I mean, more than, for example, Japan or China, for that matter. Australia does have a real whiskey culture, which is partly, I suppose, because so many of the people there came from whiskey cultures. So it's sort of in their blood, and now it's been rediscovered by people like Starward and stuff like that, doing great things.
I guess we're not really on the. I'm sitting here thinking, where do you see all that going in 20 years? And by all that, I mean essentially whiskey making outside of the traditional 5 areas.
Well, I think the traditional 5 whiskey making areas, some of which are more traditional than others, obviously, are being recalibrated. So I think the whole world of whiskey is being recalibrated at the moment, because as you know, there's a lot of whiskey being made in different European countries, in Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania. Everyone's making whiskey. So I think in 20 years' time, although it might be that there isn't the same sort of frenetic buoyancy around the world that there is at the moment, because it's to be honest, it's hard to see that being sustained at the level that it's been at for the past few years. But I do think in 20 years' time or so, I think the world whiskey map will look very different from the way it looks now. I think the important thing is that within that redrawn world whiskey map, the distinctiveness of each of the categories has to be really maintained. And I think if you were to ask me, one of the things that might worry me about the world of whiskey at the moment is that there's some very blurred edges around Scotch and bourbon and Irish whiskey, and everyone using wine finishes and stuff like that. It's like, really, how different are these categories anymore?
Yeah.
Is that more from a regulatory standpoint, or from the from a sensory profile, from a characteristic?
Do you mean distinctiveness, Liz?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious.
I think both. I think because you can't have one without the other. I mean, your regulations can help you to protect that distinctiveness, but if in the end all whiskey around the world ends up sort of nosing and tasting the same, then what have you got?
I know Jim
category
Rutledge
destroying. That's whiskey category destroying, or certainly from a value point of view. I remember I worked in marketing for Diageo, so I'm very conscious of value as a critical factor in whiskey.
Yeah, you don't want to blur something to the point where it's not a thing anymore.
Right,
those boundaries gone. And
at the same time, Nick, you gave a speech about, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. It was the World Whiskey Conference in New York, where you kind of spanked the audience in a way. They were
it was we had video of that.
After lunch, Marty, and I was asked to be provocative so that people didn't fall asleep.
You were very
fulfilled my brief very well.
You were. I mean, people were kind of you had a tone like, "Hey, don't come near me, I'll smack you." There was a because you were talking about how the Scotch whisky industry had painted themselves a little bit into the corner. I think this was also right about the time Diageo was getting a lot of flack because they want to introduce mezcal, and tequila barrels.
Yes,
as far as aging whiskey, and you were talking about, hey, you paint yourself into a corner as far as innovation. Where are you going to go? How many different wine barrels can you use for a finish? And you're kind of running out of stuff to flavor your whiskey.
The answer to that, Marty, is apparently not, because just and I mean, the thing there's an important point about innovation and distinctiveness. Right, the Scotch whisky regulations are the strictest in terms of any spirit category in the world. Okay, they allow huge opportunity to do different things. I don't necessarily want to use the word innovation, because, as Lou said before we started going live on the broadcast, most of these things have been done before, right? But very often they've been forgotten about, or for one reason, sometimes good reasons or another. Scotch whisky regulations allow you to do a huge amount of different things, but it takes time. It takes time. And businesses, we'll go back to that business thing, making whiskey to make money, don't have time. If they want a new innovation for brand X to go on the market next year, which maybe 12, 18, what are you going to do? You're going to do a finish. It's the laziest way of innovation. It's the absolute laziest way of innovation. And as we know, a lot of these finished whiskies, let's say, aren't great. I mean, some are, the pioneers. Where I talk about David Stewart in the book, all the work he did with the Balvenie Portwood finish, and Bill Lumsden, the work he did. I mean, these were that was different, because they were taking a technique of re-racking that was very familiar in the industry. What do you do if something's not great? Well, you stick it in another cask and cross your fingers, and they took that, as it were, from the back room and put it on the shelf. So they made re-racking a thing, and they called it finishing. It's a practice that had gone on for years. And the first ones were great, and I think the classic malts, Diageo's classic malts distillers edition, which I was partly involved in doing. I came at the end of that process. I think some of those are great. The Lagavulin Pedro Jimenez is just a sensational whiskey, and it's that different from regular Lagavulin. There's a real something going on there between the wood finish and the whiskey. But others not so great. But it's quick. It's quick. And I have to say, I take my hat off to Johnny Walker, who've just produced their high rye blend.
Yeah.
Because what they did was go and make rye whiskey within the Scotch whisky regulations at United Distillery, where they've got a mash filter. So the problems that most Scotch whisky distilleries would have making rye whiskey were not an issue there.
That was absolutely brilliant.
Which was not why the mash filter was put in, but it turned out to be a very, very good thing to have. And they went away and made it, and they waited, and now they've put it in a blend, all declared, all within the regulations. Fantastic, More people should be doing that within Scotch. That's what more people should do.
Well, another chapter in your book is something I I always have a lot of questions about it. Is the whiskey collectors and collecting. I always when we had Charlie Smith on a couple of weeks ago, I brought up a quote he gave me when people asked, "Hey, how long can I keep a bottle of whiskey? Can I keep it for like 20 years?" And I said, "Well, at the time I had no idea." I go, "I don't know. I'll contact guys in Scotland." So I wrote to Charlie and said, "Hey, Charlie, how long can you keep a bottle of whiskey? This guy wants to know if you can keep it for 20 years." And he goes, "Keep it for 20 years? Tell him to drink it. What's he want to do? Put us out of business?" Oh, it made sense, right? It's a product. I make it. I want you to drink it. It really doesn't do much good just sitting on your shelf. All these folks who have collections, it's kind of cool in that they have little pieces of history, but whiskey doesn't really last forever if you're not storing it right. And it's really there to be drank. So what is your take on the whole collectors?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I've spent my time in whiskey being pursued by, more often than not, rather strange men who pull things out of their pockets and go,
"Oh my God, there's a quote.
Let me show
I'm
you
taking
my
that one
whiskey
home with
collection."
me.
And it used to be photographs. If anyone can remember photographs, now it's all on the phone. And it's a harmless enough. I suppose you'd call it a hobby, for people. And it's great that you can go onto auctions and buy old bottles of whiskey at sometimes reasonable prices, sometimes not so reasonable. I mean, I've been lucky to buy old whiskies and taste them. We did a fantastic lineup of white horses a few years ago, from I think the earliest we had was the 20s through to present day, which was just fascinating stuff. But that's not collecting, that's buying and opening, Marty, which is
right.
A bit different. And of course, what's happened, as we all know, over the past 10 years or more, well, actually more, probably 15, 20 years, is collecting as speculation or collecting as investment. And now the industry, both in Scotland and in the US and all over the world, are really just producing things to be bought as collectibles. In this country, in the UK, there are some magazines, and in the back pages of them, you have collectible plates and collectible dolls and collectible anniversary railroad carriage models and stuff like that. And I fear that the sort of collectible whiskey market, which heretofore had just been sort of pretty ghastly ceramic packaging and stuff like that, but now it's become the sort of, no, it's so and so cast finish this, and it's only X number of bottles, and we're going to sell it to you for some ridiculous price, and you're going to buy it thinking that if you keep it for 5 or 10 years, you're going to make money out of it. Well, at the end of 5 or 10 years, there's going to be lots of people selling the same thing, which they all bought, and who's going to be interested in buying it? I'm not really sure.
You just published a piece about this recently.
I did, Lou. Although that was actually about cask investment, so that was less about buying bottles than about the thing I wrote about cask investment was looking actually at the late 1960s and 1970s, where I hadn't realized there was a huge sort of uptake of or creation of businesses offering investments in Scotch whisky, both in the United States and in the UK and in Australia as well, in Canada a bit. And this was provoked by the fact that so much whiskey was being made that many, not sort of top grade distillers, but smaller companies needed to finance their whiskey stocks. And they chose to do that by selling these cask investments. And of course, some of the companies actually had whiskey to sell, but some, as it turned out, didn't actually have whiskey to sell. In the United States, what they were doing was illegal anyway, because the Securities Exchange Commission determined that they were selling unlicensed securities. So after a flurry of these businesses going for about 3 or 4 or 5 years, they were all put out of business, or at least they couldn't trade anymore. Some went out of business. Some people went to prison as well, both in the US and the UK. And one of the things that was intriguing about writing the article was looking at the adverts, mostly newspaper adverts, of course, that these companies were using both in the US and the UK in the late 60s and early 70s, and looking at the headlines and just thinking about those in comparison to the headlines we see from cask investment companies today, which anyone who's got a whiskey interested social media feed will be full of this stuff. You know, if you go to Google now and type in whiskey, you get all these whiskey investment companies, and they're all promising today the same absurd returns that people were promising in the 1960s and 1970s, making exactly the same claims about what they're offering to consumers, what they're able to offer to consumers. So that's why I ended the article with the headlines of what happened at the end of all of this in the sort of 73, 74, which were all the headlines about people going to jail and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. Because it seems to me that's where some of this cask investment is going to end up. And also, it will bring whiskey into disrepute. So again, for the category, and in principally this is a Scotch whisky category at the moment, it's reputationally damaging. Yeah, it really is.
Well, it's something with the how 30 years ago when I was bartending, there was no information. I had no information on whiskey. I mean, there were books, I guess, out there, but I had no idea, where to look. I'm not even sure if Barnes and Noble was even around, but I wouldn't even have thought that there was a book on whiskey. It wasn't until, oh, by the way, that's right. It wasn't until I met Evan Katnack, who you talk about in your book, who was really the first brand ambassador for whiskey that I ever knew. He and Anthony Burnett, who was with Glenmorangie at the time. Those are the only two guys that were coming over, and they're standing there in their kilts and talking about Scotch, and it seemed so weird and foreign. And I go, oh, what the heck's whiskey? But it was fascinating because we had no internet.
Yeah.
There was nothing. I mean, but to think how it's grown and how it's changed. Now you got these guys collecting, and you have Facebook where people take pictures of a bottle of whiskey like it was their new baby, and they're showing it off and look what I found. It's like, okay. But talk a little bit about Evan and there was a whole group of guys. And I don't know, were you behind that? Were you part of that? Where Gordon Bell and some of these other guys
No,
were?
that had started when I sort of moved across from my archive role into my first marketing role. The Gordon Bells of this world, Evan Katnack, and other people were already starting to go out on the road. And actually, Marty, if I can say, one of the things that Sukhinder Singh was really anxious that I write about was about people and people that had been important in the industry, and not necessarily just the people that everyone knows about, which is sort of the Tommy Dewars and all of that stuff. And that turned out to be a really enjoyable part of the book, I think. And again, I learned a bit that I hadn't fully realized. Yeah, there's some people, a whole thing about whiskey people.
Yeah, I'm not in this. So I'm looking.
Well, just
plenty of pages here, Nick. Plenty of pages. Nothing about me.
Well, Marty, your time will come. Your time will come. But in writing about the whiskey people, I was lucky enough to speak to Jack Milroy, who, with his brother, responsible for the very famous shop still there in Soho. They're not now involved in it. And Jack was a wondrous source of anecdote. And I hadn't really realized how important he and his brother were in that moment when single malts were kicked off. I mean, I'd always thought the single malt story was just about William Grant's. and that was David Gordon and Charlie Gordon. But although they, of course, were hugely important, you had to have people who were selling the stuff as well. So in terms of that whole kickoff of single malts, on the one hand, you've got the producers looking to do something new, welcoming visitors to their distillery, all of that stuff, which was quite unheard of when they started doing that at Glenfiddich. But you also needed, quite in a sense, and I'm sure if Jack were to hear this, he wouldn't be upset if I described him and his brother as slightly rascally people, in the very best sense of the word, doing deals and getting people interested and involved. And I mean, I do some numbers in the book, and I can't remember quite what they are, about the number of malt whiskies they had in 1965, which might be 3 or something. Then in 1970 they had 15. Then in 1975 they had 35. And so on and on it goes. And if they hadn't have been pushing for those malts and going to companies like the DCL, the forebear of Diageo, and just saying, well, you may not know it, but you've got great single malts and we want to be able to sell them. If they hadn't been doing that, then I think the malt whiskey thing would not have happened in the way that it did. So people like that need to be acknowledged for their contribution to the industry. People like Evan, and maybe one day, Marty, even people like yourself need to be honoured, for what they've done.
Thanks, Nick. I'm just going to, like an old soldier, just fade away. It's all right. What now? Is Jack and his brother, are they descendant of Wallace Milroy?
No, Jack and Wallace were brothers. Who Jack started up the business.
Oh.
Wallace came in. Wallace died a few years ago. Jack's a very elderly gentleman now, but still sounds as rascally as ever. So,
Wow. Well, and that's the other thing. The whole, now you were around though when tourism. The distillery visited. I mean, I think it existed for quite some time prior, but not on any scale as it does today. I mean, it's a huge industry, especially in Scotland, but in Kentucky and everywhere else. I think Kentucky kind of followed suit after seeing what a boom it was. And now even in Scotland, or not Scotland, I mean Ireland, the Irish weren't doing a lot of tours of live distilleries. I believe Bushmills was the only one you could visit at one point.
I mean, it's interesting because when Grants opened up Glenfiddich, they were very, very publicly said this is one of the most important things we do. Both to bring our customers and trade guests here, but also to let the public come and see how whiskey is being made. They were absolutely revolutionary in that respect. And if you want to know what the Distillers Company at the time thought about people visiting distilleries, then you can read my entry on the Distillers Company in this brilliant book that's just been produced. Because I can't actually, I think on a broadcast, I can't say what I put in my article. So you have to go and read it.
Double plug.
When I joined in 1990, there were some visitor centres within the old DCL. They had a visitor centre at Lagavulin, and there's been a visitor centre at Blair Athol. Lagavulin was a bit different, but most of the visitor centres in the 90s, well, they were small, and they were also very much tied to a phenomena that really doesn't exist in the same way now, which was coach party tours, mainly of elderly people, and these were mostly just convenient places for them to stop. Right, convenient. The word being convenient. So you could drive up the A9, which is the main road that goes all the way north in Scotland, and stop up at a few different places. And I think the whole nature of whiskey tourism has been transformed again, like this collecting thing and everything else over the past 15, 20 years or so. So now most whiskey tourists are what they call independent travelers, self-driven or in small parties and hire a minibus and go around. and the numbers and the amount of actually income, go back to the business. It's all about business. The amount of income that distilleries now make from visitors is huge. And certainly when I was involved in marketing, we always thought that someone that visited a distillery, if they were treated in the right way, got the right experience, were going to be your ambassadors for life. And there's no doubt that in categories like bourbon and malt whiskey, Scotch malt whiskey, that word of mouth recommendation that you get from people coming into intimate contact with your product, either, Marty, through all the tastings that you would have done when you were in the Masters of Scotch, or by actually being able to visit a distillery, that word of mouth is priceless. It's sort of something you can't buy. And I think that's so important now for brands, and it's why they're investing so much, at all the distilleries now.
Well, I remember in the late 90s, Chivas outsold Johnny Walker in the US. That's what we were told. And then we started doing those mentor events, which would be 150 to 200 people a night. Sometimes you do 2 sessions a night, so that'd be 400. And next thing you know, man, Johnny Walker just took off. Now, it would have been great to have those, Evan and Gordon and these other guys, because that's what really drew me in. I loved seeing these old Scottish guys coming in. They're wearing the kilt. When they slapped a kilt on me, I grew up on the Southwest side. I'm an Irish kid, and hear him have a kilt on, and I put on a fake Scottish accent at first, and then drop it at some point. People would get really bummed out and say, "What happened to your accent? Why do you keep it up?" I go, "Dude, it ain't real. Want me to lie to you?" But it grew it. It just grew it. And again, Liz, going back to the whole Talisker thing and to what you said, Nick, you go to those distilleries and there's something about it. Tasting whiskey at a distillery when there's a real experience to it, and you've seen how it's made, and you see the passion of the people making it, it globs onto you, man. There's something about it.
Well, and we all know that people visiting distilleries, both in Kentucky or Tennessee and in Scotland, there will be, for some of them, it's like a pilgrimage. It's an absolute, and we used to look at the visitors book at Lagavulin every now and again. We just see what people were writing. This was before you could do TripAdvisor, of course. If anyone remembers those days. And the stuff that people wrote in the visitors book was like gold. It really, if you wanted to get some idea of the affiliation that consumers who visited these places had with the brands there, it's quite astonishing.
Yeah,
we can see that with the we had a section in Whiskey Advocate where we invited people to send in pictures, show us your Whiskey Advocate, whatever. The number of pictures that were taken in front of those big distillery names on Isla. I mean, it would be a third of the pictures every issue, because people they wanted to be there, and when they got there, they wanted to memorialize it.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many photographs I've got of Lagavulin on my phone. I mean, it's crazy,
How can you not?
Well, that's just it. I mean, you watch you're on your social media. You were constantly, anytime you went to Isla or any of the distilleries, you were posting all over like a little kid. I mean,
I thought you were going to mention the martinis that he was.
There's those too. That's true. Yeah. For a guy in the Scotch business, you sure do like. Here's one for you, Nick. Have you ever tried a Smoky Joe Martini?
A Smoky Joe Martini.
Yeah. So we went to one time. I went over to Kettle One. We went over to Kettle One, and I introduced the guys there because he said he really loved Lagavulin, but he worked for Kettle One, so he's going to drink Kettle One vodka. And so I said, okay, here you go. Rinse your martini glass with some Lagavulin. Drink it. You don't want to waste it. Down it. So you've rinsed the glass. You chilled your vodka, however you like it, shaken or stirred. Pour it in. A couple of nice briny olives. Boom! The smoke from the Lagavulin rises through the vodka.
Where's the Joe? Where's the Joe?
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know. That's what they call it.
Okay,
I didn't name it. You can call it a smoky martini, but I think Smoky Joe just kind of gives it a Smoky Joe. Hey there, mister. You know, kind of that guy.
Yeah, like
Gives you a little character to envision drinking. Hey there, mister.
On that note, there was actually a question from the audience. So before we leave, I'm going to get to that. John McShane asks, Nick, do you remember the myth and the magic documentary from some years ago when you talked about the science and what we don't know? Annabelle was in it too.
I do. I did actually see that question, and hello, John, if you're there. So obviously, John, easier to see you on Zoom than it is to arrange a lunch together. It's my fault, not John's, by the way. Actually, yeah, I do, and I think actually, I have to say that I've got more interested in the development of science in distilling in the late 19th, early 20th century than I ever thought I would be, and that's partly because, you know, if you look at the sort of journals, Institute of Brewers and stuff like that, it's quite clear that whiskey making was a generation behind brewing in terms of the application of scientific ideas and techniques. About the only thing I think that the whiskey guys really had down to a T was their understanding of hygiene. And that's odd because you see these photographs and old photographs and the distilleries look a real mess. And there's a talk given by a man called Stuart Hasty, who's very important in terms of science being introduced into Scotch whisky distilling. And he apologized for the photo. It must have been glass lantern slides, I imagine. And he apologized for these images and said, what you have to understand is that what you see on the outside of a washback is not what it's like inside, because he was actually talking very much about hygiene. And if you terroir book here, by the way.
Yep.
If you which I was looking at the weekend, it's really interesting. If you look at this book, which is the just published notebook of Takasura, Masataka Takasura in Campbelltown at Hazelburn Distillery, and this is his little spidery notebook of all his notes and drawings of how Hazelburn Distillery worked, and the emphasis on hygiene. This is 1920, I think 1921. The emphasis on hygiene is remarkable, and it's not what you see in the photographs. So the photographs are somewhat misleading on that. Yeah.
Well, didn't the Talisker Distillery have a little bit of a fire, an explosion back in the 60s? Because when the Stillman was smoking in the distillery.
Well,
What happened?
66 or 68. I'm not sure if the Stillman was smoking, but there was a ceilidh going on in the village hall, which was just slightly up the hill from the distillery, and I think the Stillman may have been up the hill rather than at his position when the rivers of flaming whiskey were released and went down into the lock. It must have been some sight actually to see that.
That's kind of a great name, title for a song. Rivers of Flamin' Whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
Eh?
Not to be confused with Fireball. Dr. Nick, thank you so much for joining us. Again, everyone, book goes on sale next week. So
best Christmas present I can tell you.
I just checked out on Amazon. You can get this on Kindle now. So you can get this Kindle for about $15.
You want the real thing. You want to be able to touch it. I mean,
but hardcover, hardcover, $600.
I think
this is how much it's going for on Amazon.
This is the Christmas present you need and should not be afraid to ask for.
Indeed.
Here's the book you need. This might not be the book you wanted.
But it's the one you need.
You need like socks.
Well,
right?
someone wrote a very kind review of the book recently, and the review started off by saying, This is the book you didn't think you wanted, but you won't be able to put down.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's
There you go.
nice.
It's very kind.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
$40 on Amazon right now. Hardcover.
Just check it out. The green little rectangle is a link to check out the book. So make sure you go and check that out and ask for it for a holiday present. Before we leave, looking ahead to next week, we've coming back over to North America. We've got Matt Strickland of Cote
Ooh,
d'Ivoire.
speaking of terroir.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Quebecois. So we'll be having Matt on. I'm sure it's going to be a lovely conversation. So come back next week. Check it out. Until then, again, Nick, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much, and I hope to come back a third time as well.
Well, hey, speaking of which, real quick, Nick, did you ever find any backers to bring you over?
Not yet.
You go-
I'm still
No?
looking. Still looking.
Maybe you and Lou could team up for a little book writers tour.
Book signing marathon.
Yeah,
Take it on the river.
you can sign each
River of
other's
flaming
books.
whiskey.
All right. Well, as always, Nick, great having you on.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Be good.
Um,
Happy holidays.
Yes, indeed. Bye bye.
Cheers.
Take care.